Hey, our own Rabinowitz here, and in this video, we're going to look at light trails for Unreal Engine, a new free set of Niagara systems inspired by the 3 Tron movies. Once you've downloaded and unzipped all the files, head into the PL Light Trails folder, and in there you're going to find a whole project setup, and what we really want to pay attention to is this content folder. So head into that, and you'll see this folder called Light Trails, and this is what contains all of the Niagara systems we need to move over to our project. Now, in our project folder, you'll see that you have a content folder, so head into that, and then we're just going to take these light trails and we're going to drag and drop them right in here. Once you do that, if Unreal is open, restart it so that everything loads properly. Just a note, when I recorded everything you're going to watch right after this, because I did this a couple of days ago, the folder that I recorded in was called Light Cycle Trails and not Light Trails, but I've changed that for final distribution. But in every other way, everything else is the same. So we're going to head into this Light Trails folder, and you'll see a bunch of different folders, and we're going to ignore all of them except for the Niagara folder, which contains all of the Niagara systems for these effects and a few extras. Okay, now let's get to it. So once everything is set up, let's look at how to use everything. So right now I've got an animation here on my timeline, and it's really simple, just a light cycle moving from point A to point B, and I want to add in a trail. So I'm going to jump into my content browser, and I'll go over to the Niagara folder. I'm going to grab this basic Tron 1982 trail blue, and I'm just going to drop it right in, and then I'm going to make it the child of this light cycle, and I'm going to reset its position. And then from there, I'm just going to drag it until it's right there, in the center of the wheel, and get in a little tighter and take a look and see. That looks pretty good, and something like that. Okay, great. Now, if I pull back and I play in my sequencer, I can see that that light cycle is leaving a trail. Now, something you'll probably notice immediately while using it is that if you jump around in time, it actually takes the trail with it. It's kind of annoying that it works that way, but basically the light cycle is set up to emit every time it moves. So to get around this, what we can do is bring our emitter into the timeline, and then we're going to click on this right here, and we're going to choose Niagara component. And from the Niagara component, I'm going to type life cycle. And we can see that we've got Niagara system life cycle track right there. And adding that in sets it up so that basically the particle system isn't alive before this red area right here. So if I play it through and I jump back this way, yeah, I'll see it moving, right? But if I play it through and then I jump back to before the first frame, it's no longer there. And that's going to help you just work with it. So I wanted to share that with you. Now let's get into the particle settings. So I'm going to select my particle system right here. And I'm going to come down, and you can see that it's set up with different areas for different controls. We've got our shape, our engine, our trail look, and you can click on any of these to bring up the different sections if you want to do it that way, or you can select all and it'll show you everything. Well, I'm going to start with shape right here. And right here is particle distance and particle lifetime. The distance of the particles is how far apart they are between each emission. So, generally, you probably want to crank this down a little bit. 50 is like a good safe number, but if you're doing a lot of motion and you want things to look right, you may want to bring this down to something like 10, right? So coming down, it plays back a little smoother also. Now, if we set this up to something like 500, we're going to see very few particles. So that's what this determines right here, the distance between them. So I'm going to set this back to its default of 50 for now, maybe even actually down to 10 for the purposes of demoing a whole bunch of stuff. And also right here, we have particle lifetime. I can set this, right now it's set to 10 seconds. I can set it to 1 second if I want. Let's take a look at that. You can see how that works. Or I could set this even lower to 0.1, and it's just going to disappear super fast like that. Let me reset that. And then we'll look at the trail height. Right now, if we get in here, you can see that this trail is pretty high, and we probably want it at the height of this wheel. So we can set this down from the default of 120 to, I can set this to 103 maybe. Let's see if that looks good. Yeah, and that's looking pretty good. Now there's also some other features here like curve at start and use stencil cutout and a whole bunch of other stuff that's related to that. We're going to leave that alone for now and come back to it. Okay, next, let's look at the engine settings. So if I come into my engine look here, I've got the ability to turn it on or off. So I could say right now it's on. I could turn the engine off, and that's this white particle area right here coming out of the engine. And we're just going to put that back on, but just so you can see that you can turn it off. Now, in addition, there's the engine length. Right now it's set to 0.1. If I set it up to 1, for example, it would be quite long. Right, so we pull back, we can see how long. It's as long as the particle system itself. So if we set it to 0.5, it should be about half of that. Now we can play with things like the engine color, for example. So I can set the engine color to something like pink, for example. I'm just going to reset my engine length there. And let's play that. And we get a pink engine. We can also crank up the emissive strength, for example. So I can set the engine emissive strength up to 20, and that's going to be very bright and glowing. Then I'm just going to reset that back to normal. I can play with the opacity. I can make it down to 0.1, for example, and we would barely see it right there. But if I can set it to 0.5, yeah, so you get the idea of how that works. There's also this engine opacity fall off. And the engine opacity, I'm just going to bring this back up to 1. The fall off determines how much that gradient is over time. So basically, if I set this up to like something like 5, it's going to be insanely tight. You won't get that gradient at all. Let's just get in really tight here and see. There's no gradient there. But if I were to set that back down to the default of 0, so there's a nice fade there. Now, there's also engine opacity over life, and that's kind of like a sort of a curve that shows how that engine will behave in terms of its opacity over life. You can play around and see how it works, but you're probably going to want to leave it exactly the way it is. Let's look at the trail now. So just like before, we have a use trail button, so we can turn that off, and then we just get the engine with no trail. And I'm going to turn the trail back on. And we also have trail color, so we can change the color of the trail if we want to. We have trail emissive strength. I could set this up to really bright. So that's something you want to do. We got trail opacity. I could set this to 0.2. And so it's just going to be sort of barely there if that's what we want. And of course, we have trail opacity over life. And again, you're probably going to want to leave this the way it is, although up to you if you want to play with how it fades off over time. If we move down to the next section, we've got vertical lines. And this is just those lines that appear as the light cycle is moving. And you can set the color to whatever you want. You can set the distance. We can set this to something much lower, and they should be closer together like that. Also, we can set things like the thickness. I could set this up to 20, and they'd be much thicker as well. So, and finally, there's the emissiveness, which is how bright they are, and we don't need to go into that. And then there's this section right here called lights. Let me just reset all this. And if we look inside, we can see we have the option to use lights. So the reason we have this is because these trails, because they are additive materials, they don't really create reflections or cast light. So by turning this on, we can create light. And obviously by default, it's looking pretty bright there. And you can play with things like the fall off, the brightness. So we can lower that brightness down to 0.1. And there's different circumstances where you're going to want to do it, but keep it low. Maybe you'll notice that it's not directly touching the floor. There seems to be a space there, and that's because the height offset is set to 30 pixels or whatever. So I'm just going to set this to 0, and that might be a little too little. Yeah, we probably want to get this to something more like 10 and see how that looks. Now you can see, if you look, because we can see the reflections, you can see each of the individual lights there. So that's why I kind of had it a little bit higher. The idea is just to create the feeling that it's there. Now we have those masked versions of this emitter system, and that will solve a lot of this problem as well. But for the moment, just so you can see, we have the lights, we have the height offset, we can control the intensity of the diffuse, the specular, and the volume scattering. And so basically you'll decide whether or not you want to use lights. If you're doing visual effects work and you want it to look much more realistic, then you'll definitely want to use that, but you'll have to play around and find the right balance of control here. The last thing I want to look at with this Niagara system is the curve at start property. In the original Tron, the trail started off as a little bit lower and then curved up into its full height. So let's turn this on, curve at start, and I'm going to hit play. And now we can see that there's a curve there. It's not always perfect, especially because right now I've got a particle distance of 50. If I set the curve length a little shorter, something to like 50, then it's going to be tighter and a little more round the way that it should. But again, because there's not enough particles coming out. So you can see this is what it looks like. This is what it should look like. And when you render, it should look like this at a setting of 50 distance between the particles. But if I were to set the particle distance down to 10, which is what we've been working with in this tutorial, we're not really going to see the curve. So what I need to do here, let me just bring this back to 150 and take a look at that. So this curve is really not great at all, right? We're not seeing that. So what we have to do is go into the content browser, and you're going to find under the materials section, there's a Tron old section, and there's a curve custom profile. And you can go in there and you can grab hold of this little handle right here and bring this out. And let's just bring that back, because I guess that got somehow stretched out there. And we're just going to do it like this, create a sort of S curve like this. And let's see how that looks now. Go into the sequencer. Yeah, and that's looking pretty good. So it's going to be a little bit of a game between the particle distance, the curve length, and of course that curve that we were just playing with. Now just know that this curve that we were just playing with controls the curve for all of the particle systems. They're all tied into it. So just be aware that if you make a change here, it's going to cascade into every other particle system that we have. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and by that I mean reflections, because Niagara systems and reflections don't work great together, and especially when they're additive materials like our trails. So I did come up with a solution, but let's first look at the problem. So if I play this back, I can see the light cycle reflected in the ground, but I cannot see the trail reflected in the ground. I tried to mitigate that by adding in use lights, but of course there are situations where, man, that does not look good at all. In the event that you really want those reflections, and you want it to look maybe more like the original Tron looked and have like more substance to it, I created a set of emitters that are using masked materials. Basically the same, except the material's different. So what we do is you can either add that straight up from this mask section and just drag and drop it in, or if you come back here, you can just pull this down and you'll see right before it is this Tron masked emitter one. And if I do that and I play this back, check that out. We can see the reflection in the ground. And that's pretty awesome, but we do lose a couple of things. For example, you notice that it didn't just fade off, it just kind of like wiped off. And the reason is because when you're using masked materials, there's either a 0 of invisible or 1 visible, but nothing in between. So you lose your fade over life and that kind of thing from this. But I mean, in general, I think it's going to be pretty good for what we're trying to do. And if it's not, the color's not bright enough, we can sit and try to match the color. So I'll come down to the trail look and maybe bring up the emissive strength to 0.5. And let's see what that looks like. It's a little bit better. I can raise that even higher to something like 1. So we do get that reflection. You can even see it's nicer and it's more bright in the reflection, although it never really matches 1-to-1. Anyway, I just wanted to share with you and show you how this works. And it's a pretty solid answer to the problem, but like I said, we do lose some things. Okay, now let's look at the Tron Legacy version of this effect. Now I've added in a Tron Legacy emitter. Again, I just grabbed this blue one right here and I've placed it under the light cycle. And if we do a quick preview of it, we can see that's looking pretty rad. It's got the glowing lines at the top. There's something here in the middle. You can see there's a little bit of displacement, glowing lines at the bottom. And everything is pretty much the same. Shape, engine look, trail look, that all works the same way. Then we come down to a section here called horizontal lines. And we can choose not to use them, right? So we can come back and see no horizontal lines, but why would you ever not want to? They're so cool. And then once you've done that, you can also choose like how thick that top line is. Right now it's at the 0.05. If you set that to something like 0.2, right, it's going to be much thicker. Take a look, right? So I'm just going to set that back to its default. And there's also top line opacity, so you can control. You can say maybe have it only half as opaque as it normally is. So you can see it gets a little quieter down there. We're going to just reset that. And then you can control things like the level of emissiveness at the top, and then again, we've got the bottom. You also can change the color. So if you wanted to do something like, look a little more vaporwave, you could do something like that. Okay. Each of these two lines have a curve here that right now is set to like their fade from the top of the curve to the bottom. So basically, this curve right here for top fade controls how fast this line fades to nothing, right? And right now it's set at, if you look, it's at the 0.5 mark, so halfway before it's gone. So if I were to set this to 1, if I'm going to let this go to the whole end of the life, sort of like the length of this, or rather the height of it, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to be much bigger. And we can also just set that to be like linear, which is going to be an even stronger, like more visible version. So the idea is that you can control how these lines behave and how they look in terms of their lighting, their emissiveness, and even their length from top to bottom, how bright they are. Now let's look at the refraction, which you can see is behind the trail, like through it. When we look through it, we can see things being refracted, and also that fades off that refraction over its lifetime. So the way that this works is we can turn on refraction or turn it off, like that, and there's no refraction. And also we can play with things like the refraction strength. So right now it's pretty weak, it's at 0.2. I could crank this up to 1, and you're going to see we're going to get very strong refraction. And also we can play with the refraction map softness and set this down to 0. And let's take a look at that. So now that's looking really crazy in terms of its refraction here. Now you probably noticed that the refraction fades over its lifetime of the particles. And that's happening because we have this refraction over life curve. And right now it's set to, over time, go from completely refractive to not refracted at all over time in sort of like reverse S curve. We could do something like, you know, make it stop being refractive even sooner. Right now it's at the end of its particle's life. I can set this to, why don't we say 0.1 over its life, and so we only have refraction at the very beginning. Watch what happens. See, the refraction disappears right away. There's also things like the noise X and Y scale. So if we wanted to have it be, the noise be smaller or bigger, we can control the size of that noise in the refraction. And also this refraction noise evolution, right now that's determining how it kind of behaves, how it kind of animates over time. I could set it to be much faster. I could set it up to 10, which would get pretty wild, I think, right? Which we don't really want. But I could set it down to 0 so that it doesn't really change over time, except for the fact that it, you know, fades with its effect, right? So if I was going to bring this back to more like that, we would just see it sort of slowly fade over time back into its normal shape. Finally, there's a refraction random seed, which you're not going to use too often, but if you have two light cycles next to each other that are using this refraction, they're going to have the exact same refraction. So you want to make sure that they don't have the same refraction, then just, you know, change this number to something other than 0. Usually dial it up to something like 5,000. That'll be, you know, that'll get, it's hard to even show you here what that difference looks like, but just know that this will help you get around that issue. Okay, there's just a couple more features I want to look at. If we twirl up refraction here and we come to bright end, this is something I saw originally in the Tron Ares trailer that got me interested, and it's this bright end right here. I don't think they really had that in, you know, Tron Legacy, but you can turn that off, so turn off bright end will do it right there. And then you don't have the bright end, or keep it on the way you want to. It's up to you. And then there's things like the bright end length, so you can make that much longer if you want it to be a bit longer. You have the fade, which will tighten that fade up a lot, right? So we don't really, that's a little much, but if I were to go to like 2 or something, that would make it a little more stark, but not quite as stark as it was. So I'm going to reset that. Then there's like bright end color, so you can change the color of that. Maybe you want this one to be, you know, pink or something. I don't know. Just go through that, right? Like that. You can lower the opacity, and you can also just set its emissiveness up really high if you want it to be super bright when it comes out, like that. Finally, we have our lights section, and it's pretty much the same as the other one, except it's got 2 lights, one for the top and one for the bottom. And the reason you might use that is if you wanted to see the lights show up in the wall or on the floor in different colors, you know, or just as the stripes. Because look, as we, and we just run this again, as we rotate, you can see that light isn't really being cast. Not really. It's the way that Lumen handles it. So when it's right there, we can see the light, but as soon as we can't see the emissive part, the light disappears from the wall there. So we might want to add in, let's say, use top lights. And if we go with these two right here, we'll see we've got two stripes right there. They're both blue, but if I wanted to change this one to purple, you know, I can do that. And then I have something that looks a lot more like what it was in the actual emitter. Other than that, this is pretty much the same. You can control the height of the top light and the bottom light, and I can just lower that top light a little bit too if I want to. That brings them closer together. Anyway, play around with that and you'll see it's a lot of fun, but again, it's just really there because we have the problem of light not really being cast from this. So this is just to help you in your visual effects work. Okay, what if you got one of them newfangled light cycles from, you know, Tron Legacy, and it's got a hole in the back, and now you don't want to have the light cycle trail seen through that hole? Well, I do have a solution for that, and we're going to do it through something called sockets. You don't have to use them, but man, it's going to make your life so much easier if you do it this way. So let me check this out here. If we look at our emitter here, we go down to the shape section right here, you'll see that there's this part that's called use stencil cutout. And right now it's turned on, but doesn't know what to do. So we could try to figure it out and make it work, but let's try this instead. Let's go to the geometry for this light cycle right here, and I'm just going to open it up. And you'll see that when we get in here, there's something called a socket manager, and we're going to give it some sockets. Let's do this. I'm also going to set this to perspective of, like, let's go with left right there. Okay, just like this. And okay, let's get this done. So I'm going to add a socket in, and we're going to name this socket, we'll call it trail, right? And that's where the trail is going to attach to. And let's just move this socket right to the bottom middle of that wheel, just like that. So that means when we attach the emitter, we can tell it to attach right there, and that'll be in the right position more or less with a reset. And then we're going to add another one right here, another socket, and this one's going to be called Stencil. And I'm just going to put that one right in the middle here of this wheel. You get it, you know, try to do your best to get it as close to the middle as you can. And I'm going to save. Okay. Then I'm going to take this emitter and I'm going to remove it from the light cycle, and I'm going to drag it over there and drop it on. It's going to ask me, where do I want it, on the trail or the stencil? I'm going to say drop it on the trail. And, you know, if I dropped it in and it was over here, I could just hit reset, and you can see it snaps right to the socket, that position right there. And then if I go down a little lower, we'll see that we have this stencil cutout and it's turned on. And right now it's set to use the stencil socket index of 0. That's the first one. But if we go back and we look at our light cycle, our first one is actually the trail. So we want to set this to 1. So I'm just going to come over here and set this to 1. And let's see what that looks like. And now we can see that there's actually a hole where the particles used to show up. And there's just some controls here for allowing you to manipulate it if you need to. If you need it to be bigger than the circle size that it is, you can go over to the stencil size and set it up a lot. And let's see what that looks like. You can see it's getting cut off there. We can go even bigger just to really illustrate that. So yeah, you can see where that is. You can also move the circle over from the position it's in by playing with the offset X and Y. So for example, if I were to move it, let's try negative number and see where that shows up. Okay, so we've moved it over this way, and we can move it up as well. So we can try going down maybe. Too much. So you can see that we can move this around and control that. So anyway, that should hopefully help you in getting your light cycles to look awesome even when they have this circle hole in the back there. Hey, so the last thing I want to do is just show you how to get that classic Tron 1982 rotation with this trail. And you know, it's just a problem you're going to get when you rotate it because you're turning it 90 degrees on this anchor point right here, but the emission is happening from over here. Yeah, you could try to set up your anchor point right there. It's not always going to be perfect. So let me just show you how to get around the problem in general, and you can adapt it to whatever situation you have. So what I want to have happen here, it stops on this X motion, and it's going to move on the Y. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to set a Y keyframe on this last frame right here. And we'll set that to linear. And then over here, I'm just going to move this down. And of course, it looks messy because when it's sideways rotated, it does weird stuff. So the other thing we have to do here is we need to set a keyframe for rotation right here. And I'm going to set this to a yaw of 90 degrees. And I'm going to select both of these rotation keyframes, and I'm going to put them as a constant. And so let's see what happens now. Okay, so we're part of the way there. The problem is that what happens is because it rotates, and let's just look at it real slow here, is right here on this rotation, it's swinging the light cycle around this way, and so it creates this sort of V shape or this angular shape, and we want it to be straight. So the next thing we have to do is on this keyframe right here where we're doing that rotation, we need to move it up a little bit. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back one frame, and I'm going to set a Y keyframe right there. And then over here, on the next frame, I'm going to just move it so that our emission point is now aligned with this last point over here. And so I'm just going to take this and move it right about like that. And let's take a look at that now. Okay, so it's doing something weird there. So I think that if we make this first keyframe a constant keyframe, now it's not going to rotate because it was thinking it was rotating, but actually what's happening is it's just holding it and then moving it. So now let's take a look and see. Yeah, see, there we go. So the secret here is using constant keyframes mixed with linear keyframes in this way. Like I said, alternately, you could also try changing the pivot point. So if we come back and we have the same problem here, if we go over to the light cycle right here and we get into the modeling mode, which I'm in, and just pull down, go to modeling, and you can go to edit the pivot. And I'm going to move its pivot point from the center. I'm going to try to move that to right where that wheel is. And so it would be rotating from there. And once I do that, and I click accept, then I'm going to take my light cycle trail. I'm going to reset the position of that so it matches perfectly with this rotation point. If I come back and look at this now, yep, we're getting a perfect rotation point there and everything looks good. Anyway, I hope that you have some fun playing with these emitters and using them in your work. And if you did and you're looking for more cool Unreal stuff, check out the Unreal materials and tools at thepixellab.net. I put the same amount of love into making them that I did into making these light cycle trails. As always, I hope that this helps you in your work. Once again, I'm Alan Rabinowitz. Thanks for watching.